The Panel. It's the election conversation on Rima.
And welcome to our education panel discussion today, talking about a topic that affects all of us, either directly or indirectly through our children right now. And the question was asked so eloquently a few years ago in the US that it's seldom asked, is our children learning? That was George W. Bush's contribution to this conversation. But I think it's something that, again, when we think about education, we think about the state of the nation, how well our children are doing, this is always going to be a topic that touches hearts, minds, and can generate some very passionate feelings on the topic as well. So you'll be pleased to know that I have recognised I am not the authority on these, and in fact I've reached out to some people far cleverer than I am to have this conversation today. And so joining me in the studio today, first we have Maryanne Spurdle. She is a Maxim researcher and recently has been doing some study into teacher training and the impact of this on learning as well. So Maryanne, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, good morning.
Welcome into the studio. Also Francine Bennett, Principal of Pathways College, a highly dedicated educational professional, over 40 years of teaching and leadership experience. You're definitely the right person to have here today.
Thanks.
And also Heather Bell from the Auckland Literacy Association, who joins us in the studio. Over 50 years in education and a strong interest in literacy as well. So, Francine, thank you as well for making the time. Heather, sorry. And so here we all are together, and I would love to start with just working through each of you with a few moments to get your perspective on education in New Zealand as of right now. Everyone's sharing their thoughts and political parties of where we're at. Are we doing well? Are we not doing so well? Your perspective. Why don't we start with you, Francine? What is your perspective right now on education in New Zealand? What are the big issues for families and for children?
Gosh, how long have we got? I think the biggest problem is teacher retention and workloads, a lot of neurodiverse students not being catered for in the system, dropping out the system, people not finding teaching an attractive proposition, not seeing what's happening in the schools and not really wanting to join that. And I think expectations. There's a lot of parental expectations out there of what teachers should be doing, and a lot of it does not revolve around teaching. It's actually more about social work and care. And
I can feel teachers around New Zealand yelling "Hear!" from the studio. Yeah. Heather, your thoughts as well? Does that mirror what Francine has said, or
yes,
other thoughts?
I think that the critical issue is forgetting that the function of education is learning. For teachers to be learning, children to be learning, and the whole society to be benefiting. So where children are critical and creative thinkers and making a good mark on future society.
And Maryanne, you bring a slightly different perspective today as well, because you are not a teacher per se, but you're a researcher, and you're studying in the fields of teacher training as well. So again, your perspective then on what you found so far as being some of the key issues affecting education in New Zealand.
Yeah, I think what Heather said about the point being missed, about the point of teaching, the point of learning, that seems to be lacking. And I think the areas it is affecting is teacher training, which is having knock-on effects of, retention and the quality of teaching and everything else that's changed over the years. And then I also looked into the curriculum, which a good teacher can make up for, but our current curriculum doesn't lay kind of a minimum bar that needs to be reached for learning.
And it must be very difficult as well for teachers that every time there is a change of government, there's a change of teaching ideology or approach as well. And I'm seeing nods in the studio as well too. So, I mean, you would have heard, some of the things that are being suggested right now by the varying political parties. What about when it comes to, say, getting teachers and schools on board? Is that kind of a missing component of this, or is it just adds to the stresses and workload of teachers when there's a new focus every, say, 3 to 6 years?
I think the constant change is one of the critical issues to face. And I've been in teaching for 50 years now, I've worked out. And it's constantly changing. Every time you get a new government, you get a new change of focus. People get pressured to make changes according to sort of social issues that they think are coming through. I mean, we went through the whole thing of everybody had to have phys ed every day. Everybody has to have some well-being time every day. And on top of that, the critical things of maths, English, literature, science, all of those sorts of things are just not taking the forefront that they should do in education. So you're caught. and teachers don't have the time to keep taking on board new things, and it comes down to the fact there's no basic strategic plan. So, if there was a plan that was sort of from early education right the way through to tertiary and beyond, then you've got something to follow. But there's nothing to follow.
So is the sense that they're generally quite siloed in their approach? There'll be there'll be a primary school approach, and then a high school, and then say maybe early childhood?
Yeah.
What about when we're talking about then, say, current plans that are coming into place? You talked about the lack of particularly a focus on some of those basic things. We've heard one plan, for example, is I think an hour and a half every day of reading and writing. What do we think about that one, Heather?
I think we have, when schools are open for 5 and 6 hours a day, we have 5 and 6 hours a day for reading and writing and speaking, that everything is connected. We use language to communicate. So we've got to make sure that children have the opportunity to apply the language in different situations. And I think that's part of the challenge, that to put things into a little box never works.
And so your understanding of it at the moment then is they would have a dedicated hour and a half per day? Is that what's basically been suggested?
And it's pathetic.
Pathetic. This is what we like to hear. So, and what do we think then, Maryanne, in terms of this approach that we're hearing? Is there anything workable that's being discussed, or what comes to mind for you?
The thing about requiring an hour and a half a day, it doesn't address what is being taught, how it's being taught. And over the past 20, 30 years, just to back up a bit, so the teachers' colleges, which you ladies would be very familiar with, all got subsumed into the universities from the 1990s on. And the way of training teachers has changed significantly over that time. It's far less practical from what people have told me, and it's far more theoretical. So if you have teachers who don't know how to effectively teach reading and spelling and math, you could be there all day and still have kids with gaps in their education. So I think there needs to be more focus on what are the teachers being trained to do to begin with, and in talking to people and looking at what is working and what isn't. There's been quite a variety of quality out there.
And also for those teacher trainees to have opportunities to practice in schools.
Yeah.
As we had, where we'd go into schools like once a term, and we'd have a practice.
Has that changed? Because I feel like maybe I'm dating myself a little bit with this as well, but I felt like we had teachers coming through on practicum all the time. Is that not the case now?
It depends where you're being trained.
And that's right. And I think that's also part of the challenge, the inconsistencies in initial teacher education across the country.
And what's affected that? Yeah.
Well, it used to be that schools just saw that as part of their role, to be supportive of the teacher training institutes and have students on practicum. But for many schools, I spent 5 years in teacher education, and we had schools that just said, we can't do it. We can't offer the level of support. Our teachers are too exhausted to actually have somebody that they have to mentor and guide through, because it's not easy being an associate teacher. It's not somebody coming in your class and you get to have a rest. No, it's actually full on helping in the training and the nurturing of that beginner teacher, so pre-service teacher. So it's not what it used to be. Yes.
What has changed with that then? What has made it so? Because I've heard the teacher exhaustion as a broad theme for quite a while now. What has changed that has made teaching, especially demanding now on, say, teachers today versus 20, 30 years ago? Is there any one particular thing, or is it a wider cultural issue? What's created this extra level of burnout?
There's one big thing. The 2007 curriculum is way stripped back. And so teachers now are creating their own lessons, finding their own resources. That hasn't always been the case. Nina Hood with the Education Hub released a report last week on curriculum design, and it just really highlighted the variation between the way teachers teach, even within schools, and the way they understand curriculum design, the resources they're using. It's very time confusing, easily 5-6 hours a week, just finding resources, because that's no longer supplied from the Ministry of Education.
I disagree with quite a bit of that. As one of the writers of the English curriculum from 2007,
Yes.
Yep.
I think that the challenge comes in teachers actually losing their pedagogical knowledge because there are too many things supplied that become scripted.
Okay.
And so because you read in a script and it's Thursday, so it must be this thing today. Instead of teachers making high quality decisions based on the needs of their kids and the needs and the knowledge of their resources and the teachers' resources, and bringing them all together. And I think that's actually the main challenge.
No, I agree. I think Nina's point was that because teachers aren't all, I think over 50% aren't trained in curriculum design, but the curriculum has been written in such a way that you need to have that training and that knowledge to effectively deliver the curriculum. So they haven't matched up what's needed and the training for it.
Your thoughts on that, Francine?
So you're talking about Dr. Nina Hood's variable curriculum document that she's just produced? Yes, excellent. I think she's highlighted the fact that there's such a variety of approaches to curriculum as well. So people don't know what's the most accepted one or what's the one that's going to really work within their school. And you're giving a lot of freedom, and we're told, yes, you can create curriculum, and that's great, you can. But I would come back to the fact that schools are under-resourced. You don't have enough teachers to do this. Teachers are also expected to do playground duty, to support teams, you know, take a winter team, take a summer team, be available to parents, you know, before school, after school. All of those extra things mean that your time is compromised. And while you'd love to be able to spend the time developing resources and writing new programs and being innovative and creative, sometimes you're just trying to survive the week. And I think, you know, many teachers that I've spoken to, their release time, which was, you know, contractual, has been sucked up by the fact there's no relief teachers. So they're either having to have extra kids in their class, or they're being asked to teach in the time when they'd normally be able to prepare and gather their resources. And it's just all-consuming. And I think that's what's led to some burnout and people just going, I just don't think I can do this anymore. I've had it. I'm passionate about teaching. I love working with students, but I can't keep doing it. And of course, coming through, you now have the generation who are very concerned about their well-being and you know,
work-life balance.
Yes, and I think that for you know, I read a report recently that by third year, many teachers are deciding to drop out. So in their first year, they get a 0.8 workload, so they get some time for preparation. Second year, 0.9. By the third year, they're going, this is not for me. I don't want to do this. I want my life to be better balanced than this. So it's not that they don't have the passion, and I've seen some really excellent teachers exit the profession by year 3.
Heather, you look like you've got some thoughts bouncing around.
Probably need to think a bit more about that. It seems to me that, you know, one of the things that we can do as teachers is actually create opportunities within our classes to build those relationships in such a way that we're not actually stressing about them. You know, like reading to children.
Yeah.
And that's a relaxing time for both. It's building relationships. It's supporting learning about how language works. It's learning the love of literature and those things. And I think teachers have become, I can't do that. No, that's time wasting.
Oh, right.
And that's so sad.
So is that a reflection of, I guess, what we were addressing a little bit earlier on too, that in terms of the way that teachers are being trained in general now, things like those kind of approaches to learning as opposed to the kids must know how to do ABC, but not so much how do I take them on that learning journey or maybe nurture a love of learning. That's maybe what we're saying is missing the most?
Along with the added burden of stuff
Yeah.
that you were talking about,
Yes.
Francine. The turnover was, I think for secondary teachers, 19% last year, up from 12%, which was already high the year before. And it might dip down because COVID obviously battered teachers quite a bit. But the turnover rate is unsustainably high, and there are fewer people training to be teachers now. So it's just going to put more stress on the ones who are remaining.
I mean, what can be, have you heard anything that's been suggested then so far that might even address some of these root causes that we're talking about? Or is a lot of what we've heard so far more window dressing?
As far as the political parties?
Yeah.
Lots of window dressing.
Window dressing,
Yeah? Across the board?
Interestingly, New Zealand, on their policies, I just looked at this the other day because when I first finished off those reports, I don't know if they existed yet, but they actually talk about teacher training. But none of the other parties are talking about training teachers and actually looking at how are we preparing people to do the most important thing in education.
Okay.
I think bring back the teachers' colleges.
Yeah, they're independent as opposed to the ones that are under the universities. Is that what we're saying?
I think being part of a university is fine.
Yeah.
That's not the issue. It's what happens within that actually acts as a training focus, not just an education focus.
All right. Well, look, let's then talk about when we're talking about the retention. As we've said, there's certain elements about how teachers are prepared for their new profession that might be lacking. But certainly, COVID and lockdowns and things have been an issue over the last little while. And I must admit, my heart has bled on behalf of, particularly if you got into say year 10 in 2020. My goodness, what a time you have had. This has affected children, it's affected teachers, it's affected parents. What do we think is the ongoing ramifications of this? Are we going to have some kind of a catch-up for that generation? What do we do?
I think the year 1s to 3 are the ones who are really seriously disadvantaged.
Tell me more.
That's my background stuff.
Yeah, why is that?
Primary. Because I think they've missed out on that really solid foundation. You know, the concept, if you have a very strong foundation, what you build on top can be varied. And I think without that solid foundation that goes across not just strict programs and not scripted programs, but rich, varied, appropriate.
Yeah, the students that we have coming into our Level 5 diploma course, generally 17, 18. We have some mature students as well, but the bulk of them are aged 17 to 18. They have had the last 3 years, their year 11, 12 and 13 totally disrupted. So actually learning patterns of study and consistency and being resilient through that has been really challenging for them. And it's hard to see how some of them can actually put together a paragraph, let alone structure an essay or attempt an assessment task that requires some innovative thinking, critical thinking. So I feel really sorry for them because they haven't had a good start. You know, those years when they would have been in the exam situation, the assessment situation that happens through NCA. And of course, NCA, changes again.
Right.
So nothing's constant. And I was just thinking back to, I remember at one stage we had sixth form certificate and then it went on to NCA 1, then it got changed again. So you never know what's going to happen. And that's great that there's people are proactively thinking about new ways and new ideas and how we can do better in the teaching profession. But forgetting about the I don't want to call them the client, but the student,
the victim,
who is at the centre of it, that just loses out. And I don't think it's easy to catch up. It's not easy. The work, the academic support we're putting into our students this year is far greater than ever before because they just don't have that background and they're struggling and they want to achieve, but they've had 3 years of having to basically go it alone.
Are there any thoughts on what can be done about that, Maryanne?
Coming out of COVID or...
Yeah. In terms of those disruptions, are we? I mean, in terms of, I'm thinking about the teachers that are then, having to deal with these situations and be trained to not only have to deliver the, the curriculum-based stuff, but there's also been a bit of an overlap now into, dare I say, social work. There's always been an element of teachers being in that role, but it seems to have been heightened even more with the effect of COVID too. And, maybe teachers are not feeling like they've got the support or training to provide that extra layer of expectation on them.
Yeah, I've never been a teacher, so I think the normal job sounds hard enough, let alone one where you're having to switch to streaming online and keeping tabs remotely. I think that was just a nightmare for everybody involved.
Yeah.
I mean, there have been learnings out of it. We had a paper released earlier this year looking at primary education in COVID, and people definitely have things in their toolbox now that they didn't before, but it wasn't a great way to get them. No, it was really trial by fire for everybody.
Yeah, well, look, we know there's still much more to be discussed on this, so thank you everyone for joining us so far on this panel discussion on education. We'll be back in a moment with some more questions, of course, about what is going on in our schools. And by the way, if you've got a question you'd like to run by our panel, you can always text it through 8168 with the first word REMA, and we'll continue our discussion after this.
The panel. It's the election conversation on REMA. The Panel. It's the election conversation on Rima.
And it's already been a great conversation we've had around the nature of education and finding out what the issues really are versus perhaps what's being proposed in a lot of electioneering campaigns. And I'm very pleased again to be joined by Maryanne Spurdle, Heather Bell and Francine Bennett, all with their expertise in the education sector, some as researchers, some as teachers, but all with a heart to make sure that our children are learning in the most effective way possible. And we were just touching a little bit before on the impact of COVID, but one of the things that drew people's attention to were mental health challenges. And I think, Francine, in particular, you've observed a change in, I guess, the needs of students in terms of either neurodivergency and things like that. Tell us how that's affecting schools now.
I think there's a greater number of students needing additional support in schools. And again, it comes down to resourcing and the ability of a school to be able to support the teachers through providing those extra resources for students who have special needs and learning needs, and whether they're actually in their learning or whether it's a mental health issue, family issues that come into it as well. So it's actually how are we going to be better resourced to do this, because the numbers are definitely increasing and the finance is not coming through to support that. Teacher aides is, employing a teacher aide in a school. Do you have a teacher aide, or do you have an extra support staff in a classroom, or do you ask parents to come in and volunteer? What do you do when you've got so many students in your class that are requiring additional help, but you don't have the resourcing to do it? And meanwhile, what happens to the other students who are maybe at the gifted and talented end or the middle part of the classroom? They require the same amount of attention, but often it's deviated to the students who have higher needs. And so extra pressure again for staff.
Heather, your thoughts on that?
Yes, very much so. I think part of the challenge is to put a child in a difficult position is really to sell that child short and to sell everybody else short, because teachers can't cope, in all fairness, with such an incredibly wide range of needs. And so in giving one set of children, the others may be disappointed, may be disadvantaged. The special schools that used to take a number of children and to have classes in a school, a satellite class, was a very good way that the children in that class got the assistance they needed from specialist, highly trained teachers, but they also had a lot of socialising opportunities with the other kids. And that's gone.
And how does this relate with your research as well, Maryanne? Again, we're talking about how the teachers have been equipped to deal with these kind of situations, and again, now with mental health being such a large factor in all this.
Yeah, I can't speak to the mental health, but I know that what you guys have raised as far as students with different abilities and the focus going on just some, again, the better prepared the teachers are to teach the basics, the further ahead everyone will be. One of the illustrations that really stood out to me, pulling stuff together, it kind of put a face on some of the theory that I was hearing about, some of the anecdotes. In Australia, 4 years ago, the head of a group of schools in Canberra, he saw that his teachers were frustrated. It wasn't for lack of effort, but 42% of his students were underachieving in reading. And what he did was he retrained all 1,500 teachers. And these are people who are professionals, they're experienced, and he saw that the way they'd been trained, which is the same in Australia as it's been in New Zealand for the past 20, 30 years, very focused on student-centered learning, a lot of very good-sounding ideologies, but it's not evidence-based. And so he retrained them using methods that are around the science of learning, cognitive psychology that people know more about now, which combines a lot of just sensible stuff that's been done in the past. Within 3 years, only 4% of their students were underperforming, from 42%.
Wow.
And that included retraining the teachers in that 3 years. So that shows you the impact that properly equipping teachers can have, and shows you how ill-equipped. It's not doing the teachers justice as well as the students, because they're not prepared the way that they could be.
And it brings to mind too your earlier comments as well about the lack of resourcing as well. Because I mean, I think we're all listening thinking, wow, that's an amazing story. But at the same time, retraining that many of your own staff sounds like a Herculean effort, shall we say.
And why weren't they trained that way to begin with? And I have to say, I've had several people point out to me how much they admire the Graduate School of Education in Christchurch. They've got a model where there's far more in-classroom time. They don't pair up their learners with whichever classroom teacher they're with. They actually have trained teacher trainers who do the supervision. So it doesn't put the burden on the teacher that they're paired with. And they're also getting feedback from somebody whose own teaching practice is definitely great. So it's not that that doesn't exist. It's just that's not where most of our teachers are being trained.
Your thoughts on that, Heather?
I would dispute the notion of a science of learning, a science of reading. There are many sciences. And I think it's important that we're actually sharing those and looking at the relevance in our pre-service training and then having the student teachers have opportunities to actually practice and reflect so that the concentration is on developing effective pedagogy. And I think that that's one of the things that's really missing, and it will continue to be missing as long as we have tightly scripted programs that do not allow teachers to grow professionally.
We've had a question that has actually come through from one of our listeners, Tamsin, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this one as well. She's talked about as a mother of 7 children.
Wow.
So first of all, round of applause for you. But one of the things she's raised is my concern about the use of large open plan spaces, in some cases 60 children sharing a teaching area. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it was not research-based for sure. And the open plan classes of the 80s and 90s proved that it was not a good ideology to follow. But unfortunately, there are schools that still follow that. And I've seen teachers, when I was visiting students in practicum classes, in big spaces with 60 kids and trying to cope with noise levels, students who struggle to learn, they need the visual disruption thing is just huge for them.
And kids getting lost.
And so I think that it was untested, untried, unproven, but unfortunately pushed ahead, modern learning environments. So I don't have a lot of time for them.
Well, I mean, and the point was raised too about this, idea of student-centered learning as well. Tell us about your thoughts on that as well, the effect that that's had. Is there a place for that in some capacity, or is it...
It's not binary.
Yeah,
it's not like you either have student-centered learning or it's highly prescriptive. Everybody's in between somewhere. It's what is the balance like? Because if the balance is not prescriptive enough, then there are massive gaps in what they learn. Because you can't walk into a classroom and just ask the kids, what do you want to do today?
That's right.
So the balance has to be right.
Totally.
I think one of the things Maryanne mentioned was about this principle in Australia. And I think that comes down to the quality of principal leadership as well. And I think that's another big issue. And principals who are now expected to fix everything, know everything, be everywhere, instead of being the head of teaching and learning, which is what, that's the principal's role. And there's so much compliance in education that it means that a principal's time is deviated from their core business of teaching and learning and managing a school and supporting teachers to having to do all the compliance requirements, which just sucks time. And it doesn't mean... so you've got principals burning out as well. So the turnover... I spent a considerable number of years doing research on succession planning in faith-based schools and what happens, who wants to be a leader. And unfortunately, no one wants to put their hand up when they see that the person leading the school is being burnt out, is deviated from teaching and learning, so that the passion and enthusiasm that they had gets lost very quickly. It gets crushed because you're having to do all of these other menial tasks that are required that take your focus away from ensuring that the staff in your school are getting the best professional development, that they are being encouraged to grow and to learn and to thrive instead of just survive. So principal leadership is another big issue, because we've got a generation coming through, no one wants the job, or very few people want the job.
And in Auckland, the number of brand new principals or principals who've been teaching for less than 5 years is becoming quite significant.
Oh, really?
It's a concern to the Auckland Primary Principals Association. And I'm working in one school where there's a brand new principal, and fortunately he's being very, very well supported by a number of really critical supportive learners who are guiding him. There is a system to support new principals, but it doesn't always translate. So we need to have more people around working with new principals.
Fascinating. And I mean, what can be done? I mean, you've talked about that system existing already, but is there anything else that can be done to help alleviate this? Is it just a matter of even the nature of expectation on principals these days that, I mean, if I was to put it into my own words, in fact, Francine, it sounds more like you have become if you're a principal, you're more like almost like a business manager, like an operations manager than you are really an educator. And in my limited experience of friends of mine who have been teachers as well, many don't want those roles because they love teaching. They want to be around the children, and they see, I say career growth in inverted commas for everybody listening. It takes them further and further away from the main reason they got into teaching in the first place. Is that fair?
Yeah.
It's fair, but it doesn't need to be that way. Principals who make a decided comment, a decided commitment to actually supporting learning can get into classrooms. And they're the ones who are saying to me in my current work, it brings the sanity back.
Love it. And one of the things that's come up already, kind of undergirding our discussion already, is this idea of resourcing as well. And I'd love to unpack that a little bit more, because when we hear resourcing, on the one hand, if you're just looking at dollars and cents, a lot of money goes into schools. But is it one of those issues where maybe expectation has also risen to maybe outpaced the level of resourcing that's been given, or expectation? Like, what are we saying when we're talking about resourcing being a problem, and in terms of affecting delivering these expectations or measurements of success that schools have?
I think you have to start with what the resources are being spent on. And at the moment, the ratio between people who are not in the classroom in the Ministry of Education and the ratio of those who are, it's the highest it's ever been. So you've got a lot of people who aren't teaching, who are using up resources, often coming up with bright new ideas like the open plan classrooms and stuff. So somebody's making decisions at some point as to what the priorities are, where it's going. It's not always going to where it's most effective.
And I think a lot of the decisions are being made by career bureaucrats who actually have not even seen the inside of a classroom, let alone know the pressures and concerns that people who are actually in the classroom on a daily basis have. So the resourcing, you're given a lump sum of money and you have to make it spread across everything. And I know that I was a principal for 23 years, having to make that budget work and decide, does it go into special needs, or does it go into some equipment, or does it? What are we going to put it in, or is it going to be mowing the lawns? It's really challenging. So the amount of resources, the amount of money is insufficient. It's never been sufficient ever. But also the additional pressures that are placed on teachers mean that money is being spread wider and wider. And I think there's been a lot of money wasted in going down a track that's not fruitful, not productive, does nothing to enhance teaching and learning, and certainly doesn't do anything to support the very people that are critical to making the education system in New Zealand work.
Now, here are violins playing, because we go back in time. There used to be a position called the Director General of Education, and that person actually guided the Department of Education and then eventually the Ministry of Education. That person is no longer there. I totally agree with Francine about the number of bureaucrats they've been to school themselves. That's
Yeah.
that's their core business.
Yeah.
But we need highly trained educators working in the Ministry of Education, and we need, I think, advisors to schools reinstated, so that there are people who are experienced, who can go into schools and support the teachers and the learning and teaching to take the pressure off, increase the efficacy with which teachers support learning.
Fantastic. Well, look, we've still got a little more time to expand on this conversation, everyone. So thanks to those who've already been in touch with us so far today. If you have another question for our panel, you're welcome to send it through 8168 with the first word REMA. But our final thoughts and maybe even a positive vision on the future for education in New Zealand is coming up next.
The panel. It's the election conversation on REMA.
Multimax.
brand new day. We've got your breakfast covered with Kat and Andrew on Rima. The Panel. It's the election conversation on Rima.
And what a joy it has been to spend this studio time with my panel of experts today. Maryanne Spurdle, Heather Bell and Francine Bennett, all experts in relative fields within education. And can I just say, by the way, ladies, we've had an amazing text that came through from Ross. He just says, wow, just turned in, but these ladies talk so much common sense.
Yay.
So there you go. People are clearly resonating with what we're talking about today. And I really appreciate the way you've also expanded on some of the real nature of challenges that teachers are experiencing. If nothing else, hopefully parents as well will understand a little bit more about what is going on. But we started to talk in the last break as well, Heather, you started to expand on the opportunities for, greater support for, say, principals in particular. But let's talk in our, say, remaining 9 minutes. What does our positive vision of the future look like? What could be possible? What would you like to hear more from, say, the political parties right now that are chasing for votes? And Maryanne, why don't we start with you?
Oh, cool. So I think what stood out to me, as I've already mentioned, was the massive turnaround that Ross Fox had with his teachers and his students in Australia. So I think there is definitely potential for things to be turned around quickly if the right methods of training teachers, the right teaching methods are put in place. And then at the moment, both the curriculum and NCEA are undergoing an overhaul. That could go either way, but hopefully what will happen here has been what has happened in other countries. So the UK, it did a U-turn about 10 years ago with its curriculum, made it a little more content-rich, comprehensive, because they realized that it wasn't doing, it was increasing inequity in students, having a less prescribed curriculum. Hopefully that will get shored up in the next one, and NCEA's kind of become a de facto curriculum in high schools as well. So maybe some of the changes there, maybe people will be paying attention to the evidence overseas. That's what I'm hopeful about.
Heather?
I think that more emphasis needs to go on teacher training and a rich, connected training across the country. I think it was Beebe who said that a good teacher should be able to go to any part of New Zealand and perform. And I think that's true. Children are entitled to a high quality education regardless of where they're from. That's the ethical thing. And we need to have lots and lots of support, like curriculum advisors, highly trained people who are available to support and to guide.
And Francine?
I think there's definitely a heart and a mind for change, and if we believe the current polls, it's looking like there could be some change. But I think what people have to realise, and teachers, educators, principals, that it's not going to happen overnight. I remember having a conversation with Anne Tolley, who was the Minister of Education, after the last time when there was a long period of Labor government and the National government, and she told me that it took them 3 years to unpack everything that had happened to be able to start a trajectory going forward. And I think we all want change, and we want it to happen overnight, and it's not going to happen overnight. And I think, even just hearing about how many doctors are going to be trained, by 2027, forgetting that it actually takes them 6 years to train. So you're not going to get, somebody hasn't done the maths, because you're not going to get the doctors till 2033.
Sure.
But it's the same with teachers. The training takes time. And anything you put in place, it's not going to happen this year or next year. It needs to be, I think they need to get a lot of people around the table and have some strategic planning sessions that actually look nationwide. What do we do from preschool right the way through to tertiary and beyond? There's been a focus on trades education by this current government, which has actually neglected some of the other areas that are really important as well. So I think trades are great. And it's an area of education that a lot of people go into. But what about the other areas that are being neglected? And when you hear of universities closing down departments because there are not enough students anyhow, that's a tertiary dilemma at the moment. Nobody wants to come do training and pay all that money to train to do something that in a year or two, they might not want to do that. The fees-free thing, we haven't touched on that. We gave away all this money to students in their first year instead of saying, why don't we give it to them in their third year?
Right.
When they've actually proven that they got the stickability. Because you have students that go, I didn't pay for it anyhow, it was fine. I can now choose something else. So my plea would be for the government, whoever it is, to take stock, to stop, get the right people in the right roles and start talking about what are the key issues going forward and get that strategic plan mapped out so that everybody knows the pattern we're going to follow rather than the whim and fancy of whoever's harebrained idea it was that they had at 2:00 one morning, So that's what I would like. And I think people have to realise it's not going to happen immediately. And, people are very quick to criticise, well, you said you were going to do this, but, 6 weeks have passed and nothing's changed.
Well, look, in the few minutes we've got remaining then, what comes to mind when you say that is, I think what could be really helpful even for parents who are listening right now, is what are some ways in which they can support the teaching that's happening in their school, either supporting the teacher itself, themselves, or maybe the school that they're a part of. Is there anything that you can think of that we could advise even for parents that could be helpful in terms of them playing their role?
Yes, lots. One of the things I think that really, really helps is for parents to talk with their children, to have experiences, but not just to leave it at that. Like when we're going shopping, here's a wonderful opportunity to have practical mathematics.
Right.
Yep.
Here's a wonderful opportunity to read the labels. Which brand is better and why? There was a lovely researcher in Canada who talked about critical literacy and talked about, saying to kids, what cereal do you want? And then giving them a different one. So pointing out that, kids can make those decisions. And I think parents miss out on those simple things that don't require additional training. Parents can read to their children, take the children to the library, all of those things that give the children that solid foundation so that when they come to school, they're ready to go. And when they're even at school, they can then take over and help with the shopping, make the shopping list, do all those practical things.
Any other thoughts on that? How parents can maybe show their support or be more involved in this education process?
I think you nailed it there, because the more parents are showing kids that the world is interesting, they model curiosity, reading with kids. Parents did that. It's just so good. Had a great aunt who got me into reading by figuring out what books I would like. She was an excellent teacher. And it just sparked a love of reading. Find out what will, make that spark in your kids. Be intentional, because the world is interesting.
And I think parents are first educators. They're the first educators. And and I've always had the idea that, they should be partnering with the school that their children are at and see as a partnership working together rather than, here's my child, educate them for 6 hours and then, and cover every need that they've got, instead of actually we're partners in this. We're working together. We've both got an invested interest in this child's well-being, their education, their care, their future, and to see themselves as supporters and partners rather than critics. And, schools are crying out for extra help, and there's people who could do that. I know there's lots of two-parent workers that means that a parent's not available the way they might have been maybe 10, 15 years ago, but there's other ways you can support. And that's what I would say. Become a partner, not a critic.
And for schools to make sure that parents are welcome in the school and not seen as, what are they doing here?
What would that look like in terms of them feeling welcome? How could they do that?
I think just coming in, maybe come in and chat with a group of kids.
Yeah.
Maybe walk with some kids around the playground. Maybe help play games at lunchtime. All the little things that actually contribute to a good relationship.
I love it. Well, look, ladies, it's been a wonderful conversation. So I do want to say a massive thank you. Maryanne Spurdle, Heather Bell and Francine Bennett, thank you so much for taking the time to share your thoughts and the opportunities as well. And hopefully for everybody listening as well, it's given you a little bit of insight in terms of what really does and does not matter when you hear the different educational policies that are being prescribed. We're going to put this conversation on the internet for you as well. So if you want to revisit this or, pass it on to somebody else, I'd encourage you to do so. But at the end of the day, being involved in education, you are involved whether you like it or not.
Yes.
This affects you regardless. So we thank you for taking the time to listen. And once again, thank you to my panel of experts for being a part of this conversation today.
Thank you for having us.
The Panel. It's the election conversation on Rima.